Good afternoon. I'm Michael Brown, president of SAR, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this first event in a new series called SAR Impacts. In an effort to help you feel connected and part of our community during a time of social distancing, we're offering an exciting initiative for our members, SAR Impacts, that will feature an online video series and access to conversations with leading scholars and Native American artists connected to SAR. Our goal with SAR Impacts member conversations is to cultivate a closer relationship to maintain connections with you during this time of social separation and to bring you into as intimate a contact as you can have under these circumstances with the many voices that represent SAR. This month's conversation features Dr. Patricia Crown, who will be talking, among other things, about the interconnections between drinking practices at Chaco Canyon, the potency of animated objects, and crafts production, exchange, ritual knowledge, and status hierarchies. Before I go on, I want to thank the Paulo Hemo Foundation, whose financial support makes this event and others like it possible. A couple of housekeeping items before I introduce our speaker. We want to make this as conversational as possible. This is a new medium for us. I see that we've got 44 attendees and probably some more joining us in the next minute or two. So you can submit questions, and guess what? The doorbell just rang and it's FedEx delivering a package. So I tell you what, why don't we go to the video of Patty Crown, and then I'll come back and talk about format a little bit more.
Understanding the past is important for a variety of reasons. The past isn't necessarily the same as the present. And so if we just assume that everything that is here today was the same in the past, we may be missing some important opportunities for understanding how things were different. My name is Patty Crown, and I'm an archaeologist. I teach at the University of New Mexico in the Department of Anthropology, and I am a Weatherhead scholar at SAR. My father was a landscape artist who painted outside. And so instead of painting, I would wander around looking at the ground wherever he was painting, looking for remains from the past. And that led me to an interest in archaeology. We went on a camping trip to Chaco Canyon. I was 15, and we did a tour with one of the rangers who was a young woman. That was the moment when I decided to be an archaeologist, talking to her about Chaco Canyon and realizing there were opportunities for learning about the past in this profession that went beyond my just scanning the ground when we were out painting. I've had a long-term project for the last almost 2 decades looking at ceramics that are called cylinder jars, which are tall, narrow jars, and trying to understand how they were being used. Because there are scarlet macaws from the tropics of Mesoamerica in Chaco, I thought it might be possible that they would be drinking chocolate. So I got involved in a collaborative research effort with a nutritional chemist at the Hurst company. But he called me and he said, "You need to sit down." So I sat down and he said, "The results are positive on 3 of the samples. And one of them is the best match he had ever seen for cacao." So it was incredibly exciting. I danced around for a while before calming down and then writing it up. People in Chaco were aware of materials and species and objects that were thousands of kilometers away. And it really indicates how connected the world was 1,000 years ago. So I hope that my work helps people to understand that people out there were aware of a much wider world than we probably would have anticipated.
Well, we've just discovered some of the adventures of live webcasting from home. Sorry to be interrupted. I had something I had to sign for, absolutely essential delivery. Some of you, if you've been doing a lot of online work with Zoom, you've probably seen a 5-year-old run into the room of whoever's speaking, or a cat walk in front of the camera during a webcast, but I guarantee we won't have any further interruptions. It's a great pleasure and an honor to introduce Patricia Crown, who's the Leslie Spier Distinguished Professor at UNM and also Weatherhead Resident Scholar at the School for Advanced Research. She's authored or edited at least 6 books. There are too many journal articles to list or mention. I think notably, she was the 2018 Alfred Kidder Award, that is, she won the 2018 Alfred Kidder Award for eminence in the field of archaeology. This was awarded by the American Anthropological Association, and I was pleased to be there when that award was given. We don't get too many eminences at SAR, and Patty's one of the best. Her areas of expertise are, as many of you know, Southwestern archaeology and ceramic analysis. Of her many projects, the one we're likely to hear the most about is her re-excavation of room 28 of Pueblo Bonito, the room where she and her co-workers discovered a cache of over 100 cylinder jars. This was funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities and the National Geographic Society. One last housekeeping point, we'd like to keep this as conversational as possible, so you can submit questions into the question box that you'll see in your webinar menu. And there's also a second option, which is to raise your hand electronically, and if time allows, then we can actually let you speak and ask the question orally. Lindsay, who's the Wizard of Oz in this behind the scenes managing this event, will be doing her best to call on people, and we'll deal with as many questions as time allows. But let me ask Patty Crown just a simple question that builds on the short video we just saw, which is, how did you decide to become an anthropologist and an archaeologist in particular?
I actually have a short set of slides I was going to show to explain some of that, Michael Brown, if that's okay.
Glad you're prepared.
Yes. Let's see. Can everybody see that?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So I wanted to just briefly talk about, since the little clip you just saw talks about why I became an archaeologist, I wanted to show how I got from that decision to where I am now, just in just a few minutes. It started with dissertation research when I was a graduate student at the University of Arizona. My dissertation project was excavating a site called the Chodistaas Site, which is located on the White Mountain Apache Reservation, and it was a University of Arizona archaeological field school. We excavated it from 1976 to 1980. It's a small, about 20-room pueblo, and it happened that it had burned to the ground with everything intact inside it. So we found not only lots of datable samples, but also about 200 whole ceramic vessels. And my dissertation became a study of the household inventories or assemblages within each of the households at Chodistaas, looking particularly at decoration and technology of the vessels to try to understand what the households had and how, at that point, people were very interested in what style says about the individual or the group, how varied the styles were. And what we found was that there was a huge variety of different decorative styles on these ceramics. This is just a few of the 200 vessels that we found there. One of the types that we found there was a type called Salado Polychrome pottery. It's a ware that occurs in the Southwest from about AD 1275 to 1400, 1450, somewhere in there. And it eventually became the second most widely distributed type of pottery in the US Southwest and Mexican Northwest. It covered a very large area. So for a postdoc, I expanded my Chodistaas study and examined 800 Salado Polychrome vessels in museums around the country. And I also did a study of their chemical composition in order to determine where they were being made. And people had pretty much assumed that they were being made in one area like the Tonto Basin of Arizona and then widely traded out of there. But my study showed that, in fact, they were being made almost everywhere that they were found. And so this study showed that the pottery first appeared in the late 1200s in association with migration out of northern Arizona towards the south. So out of the northern Arizona, Kayenta area towards the south. As people moved into new sites, they started making Salado Polychrome pottery. And it was characterized, here's the very wide distribution of the pottery in the Southwest, Northwest. It was characterized by a suite of decorative icons, including masked faces and horned serpents and parrots and cloud terraces and stars and the sun, all of which seem to relate to beliefs concerning weather control and particularly producing rain, getting precipitation. So here's what some of the vessels looked like. You can see a masked figure and some parrots off to the left, a snake on the right, and a horned serpent at the bottom. So the conclusion of that study, it's a book called Salado Polychrome Pottery, was basically that it had originated with these migrant groups at a time of demographic upheaval, and that adoption of beliefs surrounding these that went with the pottery helped during this time of demographic shift. And so it became widely accepted as people mixed and mingled into these very large aggregated sites. Well, one of the things I noticed on the Salado Polychromes was that some of them were really poorly painted, as you can see in this slide. It looked to me like it was made by a learning potter, not a skilled potter. And I became very interested in the question of, how do potters learn? How do they become skilled potters? Because like anything else, you have to practice. And so I decided to do a study, and I was funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Winter-Gren Foundation to look at pottery again throughout museums in the Southwest, pulling out the vessels that were poorly made, poorly decorated, poorly fired, in order to try to understand something about how learning occurred. Here's one from Chaco, and you can see that the outside is okay, but the inside is definitely made by somebody who was learning how to make pottery and learning the decorative style. I used, in order to do this study, of course, I needed some kind of, I couldn't just make it up and say, oh, that's made by a child. I needed some kind of framework for trying to analyze and interpret the vessels. So I turned to the literature from educational psychology. And there's actually quite a massive literature on how learners develop, especially children, develop the motor skills and cognitive maturity to be able to paint or draw as a skilled artist. In the Southwest, ethnographically and historically, we find that children learned by observation and imitation of skilled potters, that they were not taught using verbal instruction. Instead, they watched and they imitated, as you see here. So what my study showed was that, in fact, learners mostly did seem to learn by observation and imitation, in the sense that I would find very poorly made pots were also pretty poorly decorated, and they tended to be small, about the size of what a child could make. But then I found there was variation on this. In some cases, beautifully made pots that must have been formed by skilled potters, were then decorated by, in this case, very young children who were really at the scribbling stage of putting paint on the pots. In other cases, skilled potters would make a beautifully made pot and they would paint part of it, and then a learner would paint the rest. In this case, you can see that the interior design is painted at a very different level than the exterior design. Now, it was while I was doing this study, and I happened to be at the Museum of Northern Arizona pulling pottery, that I was walking up and down the aisles looking for the pots to analyze, and this particular partial cylinder jar kept stopping me. And I didn't know why it was calling to me, but I knew there was something wrong with it, and I couldn't exactly tell what it was. So I finally took it to the table and looked at it closely, and what I noticed was that there are a number of places where the paint is chipping off, and the paint and the slip are gone, but there is still other paint underneath. And so this was a case where a vessel had been slipped and painted and fired, and then used for some period of time, and then re-slipped and repainted and used. And this started my research on the cylinder jars, because I was interested in this phenomenon of redoing vessels over time, renewing them, and why it was occurring. So I expanded that study and started going to museums, including the American Museum of Natural History, where I spent a couple of weeks analyzing their very large collection of cylinder jars in 2003, 2007, 2008, and 2014. I have been to museums all over the country. If a museum has a cylinder jar, I've pretty much been there to look at it. Well, at the same time that I was doing the cylinder jar work, my husband, archaeologist Chip Wills, who's also a faculty member at the University of New Mexico, began a study at Pueblo Bonito, and this was a field project. He got permission after several years in consultations to reopen trenches that are in 2 mounds directly south of Pueblo Bonito. They had been excavated in the 1920s. And at that time, they didn't take many of the objects out. They just pretty much were trying to look at the strata or the levels that they found. And they described levels that looked like channels. And what Chip was interested in was whether these were natural channels or artificial channels or canals that were carrying water for farming. And so in this slide at the bottom, you can see where it says West Trench, Middle Trench, East Trench. Those are the parts of the trenches that were reopened with UNM students between 2004 and 2008. And we recorded the stratigraphy in them. This is one of the trenches with a roof on it, so we kept the sun out so we could see the strata better. We profiled them, we got drawings, we got photographs and so on of these. But we also found, as the park wanted us to screen all the dirt. And in doing that, we found that they really hadn't taken anything when they excavated them in the 1920s. And we ended up with 250,000 objects from that project. So I got funding from the National Science Foundation, and hired 9 students for 2 years. And we analyzed almost all of those 250,000 objects and produced a book about the mounds and the artifacts that we found in them. During this time, I was still involved in the cylinder jar study, and in talking to a Mayanist, the issue of how Maya cylinder jars were used for consuming chocolate came up. And so I thought, well, it might be interesting to see if the Chacoan cylinder jars were used in the same way. We knew that they brought macaws from Mesoamerica up into Chaco, tropical species. Why not cacao as well? It'd be easier to carry cacao than a macaw. So I was able to use 5 sherds from the trash mounds of Pueblo Bonito for this initial study, which was done with Jeff Hurst of the Hershey Company. And this is the results from one of the samples. You can see the sample on the left. You can see the results on the right. You can see the standard for cacao on the bottom. And you can see that the sample matches up very well with the standard, that there was really no question, but that it was cacao. We then, Jeff and I expanded this study to include 19 sites in the Southwest Northwest and a couple of hundred samples. And this was published in 2015. We were able to show that not only were they importing cacao or bringing cacao from the South, but also that they seemed to be consuming another plant called Ilex vomitoria. It's a kind of holly. The holly register is on the bottom here, the cacao on the top, and then we got some results that could be one or the other or both. Holly grows along the Gulf Coast. It also grows in some parts of Mesoamerica, and some of our samples looked like they might have been drinking holly as well as cacao. Cacao doesn't have very much caffeine. Holly has a huge amount of caffeine. It'll keep you awake for a long time. So here were the sample sites. This shows the location of the holly along the Gulf Coast and the cacao in Mesoamerica. Okay, then I became interested in the location of the cylinder jars after the mountain study was finished. There was one room in Pueblo Bonito, room 28, shown here. All of the cylinder jars in Pueblo Bonito came from the rooms that are outlined in turquoise here. So room 28 was special because in 1896, when it was excavated, the excavators found 112 cylinder jars in the room, and there are only 179 known cylinder jars. So this is way more than half of all of the known cylinder jars. Unfortunately, they didn't have any way of dating the room. They also didn't know why the room burned or where the vessels came from. They thought they came from the second story and had fallen in when the room burned. So I put in a proposal to the National Park to reopen the room to get datable samples and to try to untangle where the vessels had been and what had happened with them. In the summer of 2013, with funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the National Geographic Society, I had 6 weeks to reopen the room. there it is in 1896 on the left and in 2013 on the right. Unfortunately, the room was crumbling, and so we had to use a lot of scaffolding to hold the walls back, and we had to build steps into one part of the room so we could get in and out. The holes that you can see in the floor are post holes, and some of them had datable material in them. Okay, so what we found was that, excuse me, the room had initially been built in the late 800s, and then in about 1050, people added shelving to the room. And in putting the shelving in, they stamped a foot into the plaster of the room, and that foot had 6 toes on it. That'll come up later, just so you know. So they put in shelving across the room and seemed to use it for storing ceremonial objects, including the cylinder jars. And then at about 1100, some people entered the room, they piled the vessels on the shelves and in front of the doors. They sealed up 2 of the doors, leaving 1 open. They sprinkled all of the vessels with turquoise and shell ornaments, thousands of them. And then they lit a fire under the shelving, and you can see where that fire was, the red area under the red arrow in this slide. Okay, so we know that around 1100, the cylinder jars, or most of them, were taken to one place, room 28 in Pueblo Bonito, and destroyed. I've done, I think, about as much as I can do with the cylinder jars, and so I requested this year at the SAR to prepare a book on my research on the cylinder jars, and it'll have the following parts. I'm going to look at the history of drinking vessels in Chaco. I am looking at where the vessels were made and which were brought to Chaco and which were kept in other places. I'm looking at the etiquette, the drinking etiquette surrounding the drinking events. Right here we have this, the vessels seem to have been made in groups of 2 to 4 identical vessels. This is a group of 4 identical white vessels. I'm looking at where they were discarded within the room, and that's room 28. I'm looking at where those practices came from, whether from Mesoamerica or were they invented in Chaco, or how exactly did this drinking event come to be? And then finally, I'll have a chapter on the current revival of cylinder jar forms today. There are a number of Pueblo potters from several different pueblos who are creating cylinder jars today. So thank you. That's it for that, and we can return to the discussion if I can figure out how to do that.
Thank you, Patty.
Yes.
So can we take the reel back to what got you interested in the cylinder jars in the first place? So was repainting pots unique to cylinder jars, or is that a widely used technique in the Southwest?
I don't honestly know how widely used it is. What we see on the cylinder jars is 3 things. One, situations like the one I showed you, where they take a jar and over time they reslip it, repaint it, refire it. Another, it seems to be a situation where there are mistakes on earlier levels, and so it's like a pentimento in painting. They repent of that and they fix it by reslipping it, repainting it, and refiring it. And then the third situation is where they seem to have plastered some of the jars, that is, put a thin coat of plaster over them, and then probably had post-firing pigment on them. And so a post-firing pigment is colors you cannot fire because they don't stay that color. And they include the ceremonially important colors like green and blue. And so to get those colors, often Pueblo potters would either just use them as a post-firing pigment, or they could put them on plaster. And I found many cylinder jars that have scraps of plaster on them. So I think they were plastered, painted, and then after a ceremony, that would be cleansed and they'd start over again.
One thing I'd never heard you talk about in your presentations at SAR was about Ilex vomitoria. As the name suggests, it's used as an emetic through the Mississippian area and into Texas and so on. So do you really think it was consumed as a beverage, or was it, are you thinking that there was some kind of ritual emesis going on, which is pretty common in South America, but I haven't heard that much about the Southwest adopting that practice?
Well, two things. One is that I have to say, because people are going to email me and yell at me, that the current thinking is that the vomiting part of Ilex vomitoria is not because of the plant. It was associated with drinking the beverage, but it was a purification practice that wasn't caused by the holly. It was just, you drank the holly and then you purified. Believe me, I've had so many people yell at me about this that I just want to say, yes, I know. Ilex vomitoria doesn't make you vomit. So I think it's possible that people were getting Ilex and using it probably as they were using cacao, that it was another stimulant drink. It actually is prepared in much the same way. You toast the leaves, you put them in boiling water, you steep them. It's not that different a process. It would taste different and obviously would have all that caffeine, but I think it's possible that it was just an alternative drink.
So you're saying if there was an emetic dimension to it, it was a learned behavior rather than a biochemical generated by the plant itself. Is that correct?
Yes, that's what people have told me. It was mostly used in the southeastern United States and along the Gulf Coast, and in that area it was called black drink.
Right.
And apparently black drink was consumed as part of a process that involved purification and vomiting, but it wasn't the drink itself that made you do that. So
I see.
There you go.
So what, I mean, obviously the cacao, I mean, the publicity surrounding your confirmation that cacao was consumed at Chaco Canyon got a lot of attention. So what does that suggest to you in terms of the social life, at least of the period before the cylinder jars were ritually destroyed and so on? Where's that leading your analysis?
Well, the interesting thing is that there's so many things that are tied together. There is the acquisition of the cacao. So you have to acquire this plant from about 1,200 kilometers away. So if you need an ongoing supply, you have to figure out how you're going to get that supply. And drinking events always, worldwide, they always impact crafting events. So drinking events usually are associated with distinctive drinking vessel forms. And so in order to get those forms, craftspeople have to make them. So if you have a drinking event, you also impact the crafts. But drinking events worldwide are often about creating hierarchies. Doesn't have to be a very rigid chiefdom or a king, but they do tend to be associated with creating situations where you invite people to consume this drink. That creates obligations, and then you get them to build you a great house, or you get in return they should provide some labor or something else. So work party drinking events are quite common. Drinking events usually go with very rigid etiquette. They often have a theatrical kind of aspect to them, with the preparation of the drink and the pouring of the chocolate and the frothing and so on. So there can be a whole range of behaviors that go with this. And then the destruction of the cylinder jars and where they were found really suggests that this was occurring, these drinking events were occurring almost only at Pueblo Bonito, almost only between about 1050 and 1100. And then something happened and they all had to be destroyed. So it's a really complicated process that talks about exchange and production and hierarchy and practice and termination and animism and, you name it. It's this is why I lie awake at night and think about cylinder jars.
The one thing, I mean, many of our viewers will know about this, but cacao, I personally have never had cacao in the form that it was consumed in Central America and so on. It bears scant resemblance to cocoa, right? There's no sugar in it. Obviously, there's no milk, so it's bitter. It's coffee-like. What's the experience like? I assume you've tried it.
I have. Actually, they did usually find some kind of sweetener, and among the Maya were blessed not only with cacao, but they also had a stingless bee that produced honey without stinging you. And so they could add honey to the drink. I think in the Southwest, flavorants probably would have included berries, maybe honey. I don't know that much about how far up honey was at the time, but there are sweet things that could be added or flavorants that would make it a little less bitter than it would be otherwise.
But there were no chemical traces of those other ingredients in the analysis that you did?
No, not so far. I really had hoped to extend the study and look more at the additives, but organic residue analysis is way more complicated than I understood it to be before I started doing it. Corn, for instance, corn has, like 500 lipids in it, and none of them are distinctive of corn. So it's really difficult to identify something as simple as corn.
So you mentioned the footprint, the six-toed footprint in the site, and Nicholas Seeds asked a related question. There seems to be some presumption, I don't know if that's your work or somebody else's, that the polydactyly was associated with an elite. What do you think about that? Where do you think that notion came from? Where did it go? Tough questions, but I'd be curious about your response.
Well, there has been interesting work on polydactyly in Mesoamerica that has shown that polydactyly was associated with not only with godlike beings, but also with humans who were honored, who were treated quite well. And so when we found the six-toed footprint in room 28, we became interested in the whole issue of polydactyly in Pueblo Bonito, how common it was. And so I worked with Hannah Matson of the University of New Mexico and Kay Martin, who's a bioarchaeologist who has looked at all of the human remains from Pueblo Bonito. And Kay was able to identify the human examples of polydactyly, and there are, I think, 4 in Pueblo Bonito. And then Hannah and I looked at rock art footprints, ornaments that were six-toed, human figurines that were six-toed, and so on. We tried to look for as much evidence of polydactyly as we could. And it includes sandals that were made to have a notch off to the side by the little toe so that a sixth toe could fit on the sandal. And so this was a paper published in American Antiquity in, I think, 2015 that drew all of this together. And what we found was that people with six toes seem to have been treated very well, including one six-toed individual that had hundreds of turquoise beads around the foot that had the sixth toe.
Fascinating materials. Speaking of beads, you mentioned that you removed 250,000 objects from room 28. So, and I presume that that included the beads and other offerings that were left, but what, before the room was destroyed, but what other kinds of things did you discover in that analysis? It's a lot of work.
Well, actually, the 250,000 was from the mounds.
Oh, I'm sorry.
From room 28, I think we had about 50,000 objects. And it did include thousands of turquoise and shell and jet beads and ornaments, thousands of them. It also included, they allowed us to dig under the floor that had been reached in 1896. And beneath it, we found evidence for, that the area had mostly been like an outdoor work area, but there was a huge amount of cattail pollen, masses of cattail pollen. So either they were doing crafts that involved cattail pollen, they were eating cattail pollen, or they were ceremonially sprinkling cattail pollen. We don't, really know the answer to that. We found the level at which they built the room. There were chips from fashioning the posts, chips just lying on a surface. So it was very interesting. My main concern was finding when the room was built and why it had burned. We did find about 30 cylinder jar fragments, and I would spend nights trying to match these up to the cylinder jars from room 28. And it turned out they didn't come from room 28. They were dirt that had been thrown from a room 2 rooms north of room 28. In 1897, they had filled room 28 back in with dirt from a different room, and it had all kinds of things in it, including fragments of cylinder jars. So that was sort of fun, but frustrating.
And your assumption is that room 28 was really a storage room, at least in this later period before destruction, or that were there activities going on there? It looked very small from the images, but perhaps I misconstrued that.
Yeah, it looked like originally it had probably been a domestic structure over time and at ground level, but over time, between 880 when it was built and the mid 1000s, the plaza, it was right adjacent to the west court or plaza of Pueblo Bonito, and the plaza level had risen so much. The room 28 was an underground room. It was completely underground. So they built a staircase down into it from the plaza. But it would have been very dark and sort of airless down there. And so it really looks like it was used for storing ritual objects, and it probably was a sodality or a society of some kind that kept their ceremonial objects in this underground room.
So Patty, as your work, I know this is a big question and I know it's controversial, but has your work changed your thinking about the nature of social inequality at Chaco and who the elites were and what the basis of their power was?
Here's the small part that cylinder jars play in that. Drinking events can help to create hierarchies. because some people understand the etiquette and some do not. There are always the people serving the drinks and those consuming them as guests. There is always an order to which people can drink. And all of those things together create some kind of hierarchy. But in the case of the cylinder jars, they almost never are found with individual burials. There are only 2 out of the 179 that might be with burials. And if they're with a burial, that suggests they belong to the individual and that the cylinder jars were their personal property. But almost all the rest of them come from these storage rooms. And the storage rooms almost certainly belong not to a clan, or to an individual, but to a ritual society or sodality of some kind. And that, to me, may create a hierarchy of sodalities, so that different ceremonial societies have different rituals, and some are better than others, or some have more history, or some are considered to be favored by the gods. But it doesn't really tell us much about individuals creating a hierarchy, if you see what I mean. It doesn't provide the means for an individual to rise above everybody else. It provides a means for a society to rise above, or sodality, a ritual group to rise above other ritual groups.
Right. I assume you've tried to, I remember from some of your presentations, you've shown Maya cylinder jars that looked similar in some ways, but what about that vast territory between Chaco and Central America? Have similar ceramics been found and documented in Uto-Aztecan territory and so on?
There's a Mayanist, Dory Reeds Boudet, who kindly put together a slide for me that has cylinder-shaped vessels over a huge swath of time and place in Mesoamerica. They seem to occur in a lot of places, but there's a big area of Mesoamerica towards the north where not that much work has been done, and we don't know that much about what was in that area of northern Mexico. And so I don't really know the answer to that. I don't know if there were cylinder jars closer. I don't know if they got the idea from Mesoamerica or not. It seems likely that they got, since cacao is associated with it, that those things came together. But that's very difficult to prove.
And I presume we don't know much about the trading relations that would have brought the cacao beans north and so on. What's your thinking about that?
Well, they either have to go south and get them, or people from the south have to bring them north, or there has to be down the line exchange. And I personally have come to believe this year, reading at SAR, that initially people from Chaco went south and learned how to prepare and acquire cacao, and sort of set up relationships with people to the south so that they had some kind of ongoing supply. After that, I don't know if there were other means for cacao to get there. People brought it north. I really have no idea. And it honestly, it's rank speculation at this point. I just make stuff up.
Well, isn't that what Southwestern archaeologists do?
That was so nasty.
No, it's an admiring comment, I have to say, because these issues are so fascinating to people, and there's so much that scientists like you have been able to uncover, but there's still a lot that we don't know, and I think people are curious about it. What is the most surprising thing, I guess, that you've discovered in your time at SAR? Is there anything that you just hadn't had a chance to really wrap your mind around before that has come out as you've been writing this material?
Actually, there are a few things, but everybody has to promise they won't tell anyone.
Such as?
One, I do, being at SAR has given me such an opportunity to think, to read, and to talk about cylinder jars with colleagues, especially talking to Tim Idaki from Zuni Pueblo, who replicates cylinder jars, has been really eye-opening and just an incredible opportunity for me. So here's the new thoughts that have occurred to me during my time at SAR. One is that for a long time, I felt that room 28 had to either be a clan storage room or a sodality. And I'm sure the listeners all know that a sodality is it's a cross-cutting organization that helps to provide linkages in a society that cross-cut family ties. So baseball teams or churches or clubs are examples of sodalities because they cut across those familial relationships. So with the room 28, I figured it had to either be a clan or a sodality storage room. And I finally realized it had to be a sodality storage room because there are two burial areas in Pueblo Bonito, and they're believed to be two different biological groups, suggesting they're not a single clan. They have to be separate biological groups. And there are cylinder jars associated with both of those areas. So that to me means that both of these biologically separate groups were both participating in these drinking events, and therefore they must be associated with a sodality rather than this kin-based clan. Does that make sense?
I guess so, but when you say biologically distinctive, I assume you're talking about just their genetics, right? Based on DNA analysis, is that correct, or something else?
Well, some of it's DNA. A number of archaeologists are able to look at genetic markers on skeletal material without doing DNA analysis, where they look for markers in the teeth, in the I'm not a bioarchaeologist, but various markers in the skull, for instance. And these are genetically, they're passed on within groups. And so if you find that one group in part of the site has, some suite of them, and another group within the site has a completely different suite, that suggests that they are biologically distinct groups, both within Pueblo Bonito. So people who have for a long time argued that there were probably at least two different groups there. And since the cylinder jars occur with both of them, it almost has to be a ceremonial sodality, a ritual sodality, rather than kin-based, if that makes sense. I also have come to realize that the cylinder jars often are, the way that they are discarded definitely indicates that they were considered to be living beings, that they had souls, that in making them, the vessels took on animate properties and souls. And then when they are discarded, they often have to be terminated in ways that will remove that soul. So they're treated with respect by putting shell turquoise beads all around them, but they also are cut, smashed, rims broken, The outside surface is often what I call scrubbed, probably with a piece of sandstone. They're sometimes burned. I mean, there's a whole suite of actions that terminate the lives of the cylinder jars. So that's been interesting because I had been so focused on room 28, I hadn't looked as closely at the rest of the cylinder jars until really the last couple months. That's how I've been spending my time during quarantine, is looking at how vessels are terminated in Pueblo Bonito and elsewhere.
So yeah, I know there's this extraordinary cache that you excavated subsequent to their removal, but what about the Chacoan outliers? Do you find it similar? I mean, is it just kind of a fluke that you happen to hit this one room with 100+ cylinder jars, or are there similar caches and Chacoan outliers?
Only 7 cylinder jars have been found outside of Chaco Canyon. And only, I think I have 10 that are outside Pueblo Bonito, but in the canyon. So 10, almost all of them come from Pueblo Bonito. Pueblo Alto, where the Chaco project excavated around 10% of the site, they got 1 sherd out of the trash mound. Pueblo del Arroyo, which was pretty thoroughly excavated, they found 4 cylinder jars in 1 room, and then they found sherds of 3 others in the trash. So it's very concentrated at Pueblo Bonito. And yet they're being made in a wide variety of places, but they're all brought into Pueblo Bonito and they never leave. They're rounded up and kept there.
Interesting. So what's next? I mean, where do you see your work going after this project is completed?
Well, the book will not be done by May 31st when I'm thrown out of SAR. As with many scholars, I write a lot, but I'm only about halfway through the book at this point. I've written close to 50,000 words of a 100,000 word book. And so it'll take some time to get that done. So that I'm not allowed to have dessert until I finish the book. That's the main thing. But when I'm done with that, I have a couple of other projects that I'm working on, mostly with ceramics at this point. Chip continues to work out in Chaco, and so that provides me with the opportunity to go out and do some field work with him. But I really don't want to take on any more big projects until I've finished up what I owe, the funding agencies and everybody else. Get my thoughts out on this. So,
one question, I'm under the impression, correct me if I'm wrong, that it's extremely difficult to get permission to excavate at Chaco Canyon, and the fact that you and Chip were able to get a permit is a tribute to your reputation and the quality of the project. But why is that kind of access so restricted? And if I'm wrong about that, please set me right.
It is true. In the Room 28 project, it was 4 years of going through permission, consultation, getting funding, and so on. So it takes a very long time. It's a couple of things. One is that from the 1980s, the Park Service, especially in Chaco, has had a conservation ethic where they want to preserve the past for the future. And so they don't want everything being excavated. They want to leave things, since archaeology is a non-renewable resource, they want to leave it for the future. The other is that there are 23 tribes that claim Chaco as their ancestral site. And the tribes, for the most part, would prefer that there not be any kind of further excavation. They have been very kind about allowing us to do these projects where we re-excavate something that has already been excavated just to get samples out of it. But I know the preference is that not a lot of work go out there. They prefer to allow things to take their natural course and return to the earth. The third is that the Park Service is, they have really lost a lot of personnel out there. And when I did the Room 28 project, they provided me with so much help. Their stabilization crew came out. At one point, a doorway collapsed into the room while we were in it, and their stabilization crew came out and fixed it. They put up the scaffolding. They just did all kinds of things to help us. That crew is that level of personnel is no longer there. There have been so many budget cuts and people just not replaced. And so it's hard, it's getting harder and harder just because the infrastructure isn't there anymore out in Chaco.
But it is possible to do non-invasive, non-destructive research, surface collections, that sort of thing, or is it that equally restricted?
It actually, to even do surface collection, you have to get a permit, and that means going through a consultation with all the tribes and with the park. We mostly have been doing two projects. One is what's called site assessment, where the park, we go out and assess damage to sites for the park. So on behalf of the park, at their request, we and sometimes crews of our students go out and assess the impact of the large elk herds that are now out there, tourists, whatever, on sites. And that has to be done on pretty much a continuing basis. And then the other project that Chip's been involved with for several years, he's been walking the Chaco Wash, the arroyo, from one end of the park to the other, documenting deeply buried sites within the Chaco Wash and getting radiocarbon samples from them to try to reconstruct what percent of sites are buried. Is it different from one end of the park to the other? With our field school, we usually work at the historic Weatherhead trading post, since that dates to the 1910s. And mostly we find things like a shoe, or we found a cream of wheat box. And so the park isn't quite as concerned about the cream of wheat and the Marietta Weatherhill shoe.
Thanks. Well, we've come up on the hour, and absent any questions from our fellow participants, I just want to thank you for an amazing presentation, and also for your presence on campus, which, I mean, as the senior scholar, you set a standard for the rest of our resident scholars. They appreciate it, and certainly the staff is very grateful for your intellectual leadership. I'm sorry that your fellowship has ended under such unusual circumstances, but that's what we're all facing right now, and we're glad that you're well, and that your project, we're looking forward to seeing the culmination of the project when your book comes out.
Thank you very much, Michael.
Thank you, and thanks to everybody who joined us. And you'll be hearing from us, I presume, to just find out whether you enjoyed this, what you think we should do better. I appreciate your indulgence in my having to, with exquisite timing, FedEx managed to deliver at the very instant that we launched this thing. But one of the things about working at home, when you need new ink for your printer, you got to do whatever it takes to get it, and that was my situation. So thank you very much. And members will be hearing more about more events like this and some other things that are not on the calendar yet. But we're doing a lot to be with you and to keep our work going to really realize our mission. So thanks for joining us, and I wish you all a nice day. Thanks again, Patty.
Thank you.